Hello, welcome to my fourth session on filling in and understanding the history behind and the background to the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament. The Old Testament covers some 4,000 years, and the first 1,600 or so are the early chapters of Genesis. And when we get to Abram, or Abraham as he became, we are looking at round about 2000 BC, before Christ, 2,000 years before Jesus. Abram lived in Ur of the Chaldees with his wife Sarai, who was also renamed. If you can, look on the internet, it's very easy to find them, a map of the ancient world, and see on that map, which will have the Mediterranean Sea on your left hand side as you look at the map, and the river Euphrates on the right. Ur of the Chaldees is way over to the right, and then you've got Canaan where Abram journeyed to, and Haran is up to the north. And as you look at that map, if you look it up as the map of Abram's world, you will see the long distance that Abram travelled to get to the place that God had told him to go to. He called him an Ur of the Chaldees, that's Ur of the Chaldees, in Mesopotamia. And if you look on the map, do find a map and have a look at these things, because often from one verse to the next, the people in the story have moved a long way, and it hasn't taken them just half an hour's stroll. It's been a much longer journey. For example, when Abram was called by God, his father Terah moved the whole family to Haran, which is north of Damascus. It's on the north to the north. That is actually some 640 miles, or about 1,030 kilometres. And they didn't have, I must remind you, they didn't have aeroplanes or cars or jeeps or motorised vehicles of any kind. So they were either walking or travelling by donkey, and probably travelling 10 to 20 miles per day, and then camping up at night. So you can do the maths for that. We're talking about 3 months travel minimum to get from Ur to Haran. And when they got there, Terah, Abram's father, decided to settle in Haran, and then when he died, Abram heard again the call from God to go further to a place that God had chosen for him. And he travels then from Haran down to various places in Canaan, and eventually down into Egypt. But to Canaan, we're talking about 426 miles, 686 kilometres. Again, we're talking at least 2 to 3 months travel, because they took the whole household with them, the women and the children and the animals, and it was a slow journey. It was a long journey. So it's important to have a look at maps and see what is involved for these great names, for Abram to leave everything in Ur. Now, Ur of the Chaldees is a very interesting place. I don't know if you have access to the internet. I have been privileged to go to the British Museum in London, which has a gallery dedicated to Ur of the Chaldees. And the artefacts they have there are dated to about the time when Abraham lived in Ur. And it's fascinating to see the sort of things that would have been used in his household and would have been part of his everyday life. And I've got a photo on my phone. I don't know how to put a photo into a video. I have to tell you that. So I do apologise for it, but I can, I hope, show you a picture. on my phone. So this is something that was found in Ur of the Chaldees. And here's a photograph of the second one that was found. There were two of these. They're called the ram in the thicket. If you look it up on the internet, you'll find photographs. One of them is in a museum in America, and one of them is in the British Museum. And they are depictions. They're about this high. They're quite a size. You know, they're like a little statuette. And they're made of lapis lazuli and gold. They were found in the tombs there that were uncovered in Ur of the Chaldees. And they are a depiction of a ram with his feet caught in a bush. And when I first saw that when I visited the British Museum and went to that gallery, and I looked at all these other things, very interesting things like the seals they used to seal letters with, the sort of thing they used as a letter, what was used in their kitchens and so on is all there. And I saw this ram caught in the thicket. And I wondered, did God reveal to Abraham before he ever came to Canaan that there would be a ram in a thicket in his life? And we know the ram in the thicket, if you don't remember the story, was what God provided for the sacrifice when Abraham was asked by God to sacrifice his only son, Isaac, his promised son that God had given him. And he went up on the mountain and he took his son with him, and he didn't know that God would provide. But when he got to the top of the mountain and was about to sacrifice his son, God said, "Here is the sacrifice." And there was the ram caught in the thicket. And I wonder whether either he already had a foreknowledge of it through revelation in Ur. It was obviously a very important depiction from their culture for it to be made in such valuable jewels and gold. It must cost a lot to make it, and it's beautifully made. It's exquisitely made, in fact. Or did Abraham contact his family and tell them the story of what happened to him and how God had provided the sacrifice so that he didn't have to kill his son? I don't know how it happened, but it is a great wonder to see this artifact and know that there was nothing in the religion of the people who lived in Ur that revolved around rams and thorn bushes and things. Very interesting. Anyway, if you look it up on the internet and put in ram in the thicket, you will see depictions of the two almost identical pieces that were found in Ur. So Abram moved everything in response to God's instruction and came to the land of Canaan. And the story is very easy to follow in Genesis. Just reading it is easy. That's not a difficult part of Old Testament history. And so then we go on to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and then the Jacob and Esau story of the twins that were always in competition with each other, and how Jacob, the second son, was the son of promise, and he later was named Israel, and his children. We know the story of Joseph. We've even seen it in a West End musical. Joseph and his amazing Technicolor dream coat. I mustn't call it dream boat. It is dream coat. You know the story of Joseph, the dreamer, who became eventually the head of Egypt when he interpreted a dream for Pharaoh, and he kept the whole nation of Egypt and the nation of his own people alive through a terrible famine. 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine. And Joseph was the overseer of all the storage of goods and food so that they could survive the famine. and his family came down, and they were reconciled eventually. And so they all settled, all these people, the descendants of Israel, 12 sons and a daughter. They came to Egypt and they settled there. And there were about 400 years, 430 years, that sort of period of time when they were all living in Egypt. And they increased and increased and increased, and eventually, as we get into the beginning of it, the book of Exodus, we find that there are far too many of these descendants of Israel, and the Pharaoh is beginning to feel threatened by the numbers, and he starts to clamp down on the birth and asks the midwives to kill the baby boys that are born, and the whole nation becomes slaves to the Egyptian Pharaoh of the time. And then we have the rise of Moses. That's at the beginning of the book of Exodus. So then we have the book of Exodus, which talks about the oppression in Egypt and Moses being called, the burning bush and all that, and meeting with God and God giving him his name. I am that I am. I am has sent you. And he goes down back to Egypt, having been raised in Egypt by Pharaoh's daughter. We know that Moses in the bulrushes story. It's right at the beginning of Exodus. If you're not familiar with it, do have a read of the first 10 chapters of Exodus, and you'll see how Moses was raised by the Pharaoh's daughter as he was rescued from the bulrushes and the basket that his mother had put him in to preserve his life, save him from the destruction of all the infant boys. And she raises him as her son, and when he is adult, he goes looking for his own people to understand what they're like, and he ends up killing an Egyptian overseer and fleeing for his life. Then he spends 40 years in the wilderness, gets married, has some children, and becomes a shepherd and everything, and then God meets him at the burning bush and calls him to go back to Egypt and to free God's people from Egypt. And he goes back, and there are all the plagues, the water turning to blood, and it's all in the beginning of Exodus. And Pharaoh gets more and more stubborn, and eventually there is the Passover night when the angel of the Lord is sent into Egypt to kill all the firstborn males of animal and human in Egypt, unless they are protected by the blood of the lamb that is slain, the Passover lamb that was slain, and the doorposts daubed with the blood. It's a foretelling, it's a picture of the provision that eventually Jesus, the Lamb of God, would make for all his people, that the protection is in the blood. It's not in anything else, it's in the blood and in staying under the covering of the blood. And so they do that, and the Egyptians send them away with great riches, and they go, and then the Egyptians change their mind. They chase after them, and then we have the parting of the Red Sea. There are disputes about where that is exactly, but it doesn't really matter. So we are talking about, we have passed in time from about 2000 BC at the birth of Abram right through to about 1450 BC when Moses brings the people out of Egypt. I think we'll stop there and come back for another instalment, and it's good to see you, good to have you along as we journey through, as we stroll through Bible history.